Welcome, welcome, folks. It's exciting to see you today. Thank you for joining us. We'll just let people enter the room for another half of a minute, and then we'll get started. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I am Regina Celestin Williams, the Executive Director of SV at Home, and we're very excited to host you all for a thoughtful conversation around the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act in San Jose. Our goal is to provide context and opportunity for you to further deepen your engagement as the COPA policy prepares to go before the City Council. Policy in Action at Home is a monthly informal brown bag discussion convening housers to engage on hot housing topics. Every month, we select a topic or current event, bring in an expert or two to give you a brief presentation, and then open up the discussion to ask questions, float new ideas, and identify potential areas for shared action. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone, Ramaytush Ohlone, Tamian Nation, and Amat Mutsu, on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We at SV at Home are committed to honoring and making visible the Indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. And so with that, I will turn it over to Emily Ann Ramos, who's going to share some ground rules with you all.
Thank you, Ms. Regina. So some ground rules and code of conduct. We want to ensure that the conversation and relationships here today remain respectful and productive. Please be kind and courteous to each other. No rude comments or personal attacks would be allowed. We encourage asking questions and listening as we learn and engage with each other. Please keep comments and questions focused on COPA, preservation policies, and anti-displacement solutions, and keep questions and chat on topic. Sometimes the chat can get lively, so if you find that it is distracting you from the content of the discussion, we encourage you to consider closing the chat temporarily. And so now we're going to go to our panel, which will be moderated by Con Russo, who is he serves as the Vice President of Policy and Innovation at the San Francisco Foundation. In this role, he leads a policy and innovation agenda focused on accelerating racial equity, economic inclusion, and systemic change toward a more just society. Con's expertise focuses on advocacy, power building, grant making, and policy. Previously, Con led the San Jose Mayor Liccardo strategic initiatives focused on education, workforce development, innovation, performance management, and budget. So I will let Con introduce our two speakers. Take it away, Con.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you to SV at Home for this opportunity. I'm so grateful for your leadership in the community advancing affordable housing and excited to be having this conversation with both Heather and Andrea. Heather's with the Partnership for the Bay's Future, and Andrea is with Somos Mayfair. Andrea Portolio was born and raised in the east side of San Jose, and as the daughter of two Mexican immigrant parents, she grew up with a clear understanding of the supports and resources her family and predominantly migrant community needed, but often lacked. She received her bachelor's degree in international relations with a minor in Latin American studies from Mount Holyoke College and her master's degree in migration studies from the University of San Francisco. Her previous nonprofit experience working directly with migrant families and youth fueled her passion for exploring equity-based policies, programs, and services that bridge the gaps between legislation and the realities of migrant communities like our own. And we're also joined by Heather Broomfield, who is a Partnership for the Bay's Future Fellow, working with the Policy Division at the San Jose Housing Department, where she specializes in the COPA policy, which we'll be discussing today. Her prior work experience includes time in the nonprofit sector, where she worked on affordable housing policy and in the private sector, where she worked as a consultant for public agencies on real estate, economic, and housing issues. Heather is a firm racial equity advocate and is committed to creating values-driven, well-researched policy. Heather has degrees in urban planning and political science and was a Fulbright scholar. I'm so privileged to be in conversation with both of them today, and I know that today's conversation is going to be a really lively and really informative conversation. Just to ground us a little bit, you know, San Jose has always been at the forefront of equity and inclusion. You know, we were the first city to provide domestic partnership benefits. We were known as the feminist city with the first mayor. And currently we're one of the most diverse cities in America, with almost half of us being foreign born or speak more than one language. So it was not a surprise to me that San Jose continues to lead the way in policies that are community-based, that are equity-centered and committed to celebrating our richness. You know, policies like the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act is a really great market solution that follows that spirit and ensures that our neighbors don't get displaced while preserving property owner rights. We're going to dig a lot into that today. This has been something that San Jose has been working on for a while, right? So I'm excited for you to learn more and get your questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A prompt in the Zoom tools or through chat, and then we will be able to curate that for the discussion. So just to start, Heather, what is COPA? Can you tell us, give us some grounding and background on what it is?
Thanks, Khan. And yeah, so the COPA basically is a policy that makes it easier for affordable housing nonprofits to acquire properties in the market. Would now be a good time for me to start with into this background with this slide? Okay, so this is the context that we are just backing up to understand why we are talking about COPA today. So sorry, can you go back one slide, please? Or two slides? Sorry, I can't talk quite that fast, sorry. Thank you. Okay. So, this is the context in which we are living in the Bay Area. This slide is showing the number of quote unquote unsubsidized affordable housing, affordable homes in the Bay Area that we lost between 2012 and 2017. And so what is unsubsidized affordable housing? It's housing that is affordable to households that are earning below 80% of the area median income, which are in our region generally means our workforce, right? It's our teachers, it's our retail and restaurant workers, it's our essential workers who we're all in community with. And it's also people who are, retirees on fixed incomes and students. And so the number of homes that are affordable to these groups has declined. The chart showing us that during a period of only 5 years, the number of homes that were affordable to these groups declined by about 168,000 homes. It's an average of 32,000 per year. Santa Clara County alone lost about half of the homes that were affordable to people earning below 80% of area median income in just a 5-year period. And so we know why this is happening. It's because market rate rents are increasing while wages for lower income people are stagnating. This is resulting in a lot of displacement pressures in San Jose. And as we all know, people who are unable to continue affording rent are getting pushed out of their homes, getting pushed out of their neighborhoods, and getting pushed out of the entire region. So, getting back to your question, Khan, COPA is a policy that makes it easier for affordable housing providers to access this unsubsidized affordable housing and convert it to deed-restricted affordable housing. Should I'll just keep going? All right. So thanks. So one other thing just to, clarify about displacement pressures, displacement is disproportionately borne by communities of color, in particular by Hispanic and Latinx households, Vietnamese households, and African-American families. This chart is showing that in San Jose specifically, the communities of color are disproportionately living in areas where displacement is definitively or probably occurring, according to the UC Berkeley Urban Displacement Project. So while only 13% of non-Hispanic white households or residents are living in areas where displacement is probably or definitely occurring, or according to the Urban Displacement Project. The same is true for 45%, nearly half of Hispanic or Latinx households, 34% of Vietnamese households, and 30% of African American households. And so this is not a coincidental thing. This is, a result of redlining, a lot of historical injustices that were against communities of color, which resulted in these communities having lower rates of home ownership and made them more likely to be living in areas undergoing rapid reinvestment. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so just backing up, COPA is a affordable housing preservation policy. So just backing up to what is affordable housing preservation? It's a strategy that's been developed to keep renter families in place in this context of rising rents, decreasing affordable housing options for lower income families. And again, it involves nonprofit housing providers purchasing these, unsubsidized affordable housing properties and converting them to deed restricted. So the purchase price is fair value. So as Khan said, this is, balancing the needs of the community with also with the property rights of existing property owners. And it's also, an important strategy because these nonprofit housing providers become stewards of the property and keep the rents permanently affordable over time to the families who are already living there. Many of the people who are on the call today have probably heard stories from friends or, friends of friends who, were renting a building, but after the property owner sold and a new owner came in, the new management increased the rents and they could no longer stay in the building, right? So to some extent, renters are, insulated from this in San Jose. We do have a rent stabilization policy. We do have a just cause eviction policy in San Jose. But even so, when a new property owner comes in, they're allowed to raise rents by up to 5% per year. And households that are already significantly cost burdened, so they might be paying 40 or 50 or 60% of their rent, even more, 60% of their income towards rent, they can't sustain additional 5% rent increases, especially when it's compounded year over year. So this is why the nonprofit housing provider and their ability to step in and make those rents affordable to the households who are already living there. That's why it's a strategy that we're all very interested in. Next slide, please. This is getting again to the why of affordable housing preservation. It's a very direct way of preventing displacement. The renter families who are living there get to stay. They do not have to go through the experience of realizing that they're not going to be able to stay in the current building and deal with all of the stress and negative consequences that come with an undesired move. They don't have to, and particularly identify a new place to live in a very short period of time. Be it in a market rate property or be it in, because they're joining a wait list for a new affordable housing property. So, and then again, we know that many renter families are significantly housing cost burdened. They're paying more than they can afford towards rent. And this is a strategy that right sizes rents actually to what, so renters who are living in these households or in these buildings might actually have their rents decrease. And then finally, this is something that I think Andrea is going to talk about more in depth is, the enhanced community empowerment that this strategy provides. Affordable housing preservation, can create pathways for groups that prioritize, community ownership or community management of affordable housing properties. And we know that when households, when everyone has more control over their own lives and more agency over their own lives, the health consequences that they have are better, their general sense of well-being is better. And so this is another reason why we're all talking about affordable housing preservation. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of barriers right now to affordable housing preservation, and this is where COPA is coming in, right? So one of the barriers, for acquiring existing properties is that when you're a nonprofit housing provider, you are working with different sources of funding than if you are a private sector provider or a private sector, purchaser of a multifamily building. That means that, you have to, it's a longer process by design. And when nonprofit housing providers are competing with, market rate investors, the timelines are just they can be very different. And so what COPA allows is a time frame, a reasonable time frame that allows the nonprofits to assess their ability to assemble the funding for these properties and make competitive offers. And also one other key issue that it resolves is making sure that properties which are not listed anywhere, so this is the entire universe of many of the properties in the 5+ unit category, multifamily properties that are larger, they might never be listed openly on the market. They might be happening through specific brokerages. And it means that if there's key properties in areas where affordable housing providers are working, neighborhoods that they're particularly concerned about, they might never find out that these properties are even up for sale. Even in properties, where lower income households are living, it's not uncommon that these households will find out that their property has been sold already, and there was never any notification. So COPA.
Pause there real quick.
Yes.
I hear this concern a lot, requiring all properties in the program to notify the qualified nonprofits. Are they forced to sell to that nonprofit?
No, they are definitely not forced to sell to it. They are the property owners are able to choose whoever they want to sell to. And this is this is true this is in San Jose's COPA. This is by design. This is, again, to respect property owners' rights and balance the concern. So, even if a third party comes in and says, I would like to make an offer on this property, and I will, offer less than what the nonprofit is offering. If for whatever reason, I'm not sure why they would want to do it, but if the property owner wanted to accept that lower offer, they wouldn't have to sell to an affordable housing provider. They could still choose whomever they wanted to sell to.
That's helpful. Thank you, Heather.
Yeah. So yes, this is the second element, just recapping, is transparency, and ensuring that affordable housing providers, and I apologize for the acronym here. This stands for qualified nonprofits. This is a city designated term. Affordable housing providers who, would get qualified by the city to do this work would be called qualified nonprofits, or QNPs. And so they would always.
And Heather, that just kind of helps the seller, right? Because the city has done a level of vetting, and these nonprofits have a certain level of capacity and training and expertise so that they can do this quickly. Is that right?
Yeah, the entire idea is that, the city wants to make sure that the offers that are coming in are reliable, that the organizations are experienced, and that they, are going to be good stewards of the property and, in perpetuity.
So it's almost like a safeguard for the seller, right? Where, like, if I was just a individual buying your home, they have no idea who I am and whether I'm going to be able to go through. But the city has now done the work of making sure that those who are putting in an offer are legitimate. Like, it's almost like a pre-qualified kind of a thing. Is that right?
Right. I mean, there's a reason we're calling them, the qualified nonprofits, right? They are, they will be qualified. I think we can move on to the next slide. So just backing up a little bit about, again, why we are talking about COPA specifically. There has been a very long process of, the community raising COPA as a policy of interest, and then also this, the city council in 2020 directing staff to investigate what this would look like. So this has been a multi-year process. There's been extensive community engagement that occurred for most of the period between April 2021 and February of 2023. So there have been many public meetings, and in addition, not just public meetings, but a lot of meetings with stakeholders to make sure key concerns were addressed, and that this is really a compromise proposal in the end that balances interests. Next slide, please. This is just a quantification of the number of organizations that were reached, the number of people who attended public meetings, the number of individual stakeholder meetings that the housing department held. We also in the housing department also had about 16 advisory committee meetings that were held between April and just the spring and the fall of 2021. So this included a technical advisory committee and a stakeholder advisory committee. So it was a pretty broad process. And then a significant second push, an outreach in the winter of 2021 to spring of 2022, and then yet another push at the end of 2022 to beginning of 2023. So this has been a very
Take
long
a pause here. Like, I worked in the mayor's office for 5 years and was involved in a lot of different initiatives and efforts. And I've never seen this level of community engagement before. Like, I am a little bit astounded and so proud of like the community and the work and the effort that the city put into reaching out to the community and making sure that we're hearing people's voices. Like, this should be like the gold standard for how we should be doing community outreach on these policies. So just wanted to acknowledge that and just say how incredible and what a unique what incredible effort this has been for the department as well as the community.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, the numbers speak to the level of engagement, and just, folks on both sides of the issue have been extremely engaged in this whole process from the beginning and all the way through earlier this week. So I think we can do the next slide. So just going to provide a brief overview of how this works for anyone who might not be familiar with how a Community Opportunity to Purchase Act works. I'm going to ask you to fast forward to the first. Thanks. So the first step is that the multifamily property owner, this is only in San Jose, it is only properties with 2 or more units, and it's nothing. And so there's no homeowners that are involved or impacted by this program. If you're a 2 to 4 unit property owner and you live in the property, you're exempt from this policy. This property is going to, these are commercial properties, right? The multifamily property owner is going to decide to sell. They notify the list of the, qualified nonprofits, these nonprofit housing providers. Next step, please. These nonprofit housing providers have a few weeks to consider the property and make a market value offer if they choose to. The next step is the property owner, again, decides whether or not they want to accept the nonprofit offer. They can choose yes, they can choose no. They can test the market, and then they can come back to the nonprofit and say, maybe you were my best offer. Next step. And then finally, if the property owner accepts the offer, the nonprofit will, execute the purchase, and the renter families who are living there, their housing becomes permanently affordable. So it's a pretty straightforward process. Again, the property owner retains choice. And what we do anticipate in the housing department, having reviewed how this policy worked in San Francisco, in the majority of cases, this is like 90% of all cases, the nonprofit housing provider lists their property. They inform QNPs that they're planning on selling their property, and the qualified nonprofits either are not interested or don't have capacity at that point in time, and it goes back to just the regular market process, right? That's 90% of cases. And so really, there's only a brief delay between when they would normally, like without a COPA, they might be able to list their property, and under COPA, where they would, first quickly notify QNPs. Next slide, please. So I just want to back up again, and talk a little bit about affordable housing preservation and how COPA fits into affordable housing preservation. So affordable housing preservation, requires multiple different components, right? It requires funding, it requires, the organizational capacity of affordable housing providers, and it requires a policy environment that's conducive to this work. In this case, a COPA. In other jurisdictions that are considering TOPAs, that's, also something that is supportive. And there's a lot of parallels between affordable housing preservation and affordable housing production. Affordable housing production also relies on public sector funding, right? Like the reason we all know about affordable housing production is because 40 years ago, the federal government created a low-income housing tax credit program, which created a large and ongoing revenue source that organizations then built their business practices around. And that's why we have affordable housing developers today, by and large, where many of them, began to rely on this funding source. And in addition, we also have regulatory environment that, supports affordable housing production. So this could be, land use regulations that allow multifamily in certain areas, or in the case of affordable housing production that occurs, when a market rate provider provides affordable units. It could be because those properties are streamlined, or they're receiving a density bonus, because they include affordable housing, right? So affordable housing production already has a lot of the infrastructure in place, and we are talking about, affordable housing preservation and how this entire ecosystem is, it is, in development, but it's very much, a possibility. And so we see COPA as a foundational support for some of these other pieces. And then just, very last slide, and then I'll turn it back to Khan. This is, I hope this isn't a super overwhelming slide, but these are some of the funding sources that, would support affordable housing preservation. And so we see, many regional and state policy makers, discussing creating these large and ongoing, dependable sources of funding for organizations to build their business practices around for affordable housing preservation. So one of them is already, in process for foreclosure intervention housing preservation program. This, is already a committed source. There's additionally, at the regional level, a new, this should be Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, BAFA. There's, anticipated funding coming in, not just in the short term, but in the longer term on an ongoing basis through potentially general obligation bonds and a set aside for affordable housing preservation. So, and then finally, there's another proposed bill this year for affordable housing preservation in the works. These funding sources would, we want to make sure that, this is one of the legs of the affordable housing preservation table. And so, because, these regional and state agencies are currently working on this, we want to make sure we're able to leverage the funding that's coming in at the local level. Right. And like having a policy in place to leverage some of this funding, we see this as a particularly good moment to have that in place so that we can capture some of these resources. And also, creating a local funding source that allows us to leverage some of these additional funding sources is important, because otherwise we are leaving money from regional and state sources on the table, right? We're less able to leverage these sources if we don't have local funding. So there's a lot of different competing priorities, but for funding, particularly in a context right now where we are, all public agencies, this is regional, this is state, this is local. Our budget projections for this year are not as rosy, but this is something that everyone is thinking about and working on. So I think with that I will conclude.
Well, Heather, thank you for that really great overview. And I like that last slide in particular, because it seems like, as a community, we need to ready ourselves for these really great resources. We already have thousands of friends and neighbors who are unhoused and on the streets, and over tens of thousands of folks who are spending an exorbitant amount of their income on their housing, right? Over 60% of their income on housing. So these types of solutions are so critical. I'm going back to that slide that I was so flabbergasted by, right? The one where you talked about, almost 500 folks engaged and over, 1,200 touch points and over 50 organizations. Andrea, you're with Somos Mayfair, and you have been helping to support, the community's effort in co-creating, developing, making sure that the community's voices is heard in the developments of policy. Can you tell me more about those efforts and the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you, Khan. Thank you, Heather, for the context. I'm going to back up a little bit and say why preservation has been talk a little bit more about why preservation has been a strategy that Somos Mayfair, our community, and partners that we work with, has been such a key piece around the anti-displacement work that we've been doing. If we look back a little bit about the history of our organizing for Somos Mayfair, we started a lot of efforts around just improvements to the neighborhood. That included advocating for streetlights, for improvements to sidewalks, for community safety. And then we realized we needed to do a little bit more work in order to ensure that a lot of the folks in our community who are renters, who are tenants, had protections. So did a lot of advocacy around tenant protections, which is one of the 3 Ps strategy that we're kind of talking about in terms of anti-displacement, right? Protection, production, and preservation. So we started with protections, did a lot of advocacy around tenant protections, and then said, okay, what else could we be doing? Housing is still a really big issue in our community. Our folks are being displaced. So started doing a lot of advocacy around affordable housing development. And like, yes, we know we need to build more. We know there is not enough affordable housing to meet the demand or the need for affordable housing, both in our community, but across the city. I think across the state, actually, or the country, actually, we're not building enough affordable housing to meet the need. So we did a lot of advocacy and continue to do a lot of advocacy around the need for building more affordable housing. And through that process, quickly realized that there are still a lot of barriers for folks in the community to access affordable housing, even the affordable housing that is being built in our communities. And that's due to a lot of different reasons, from documentation status to, if anybody has ever tried to apply for affordable housing, you will know that the lists are extremely long, that they are a lottery system, that depending on various factors, applications may only be in English, they may only be submitted online. It's a pretty difficult process to navigate. And so then very quickly realized that just building more affordable housing was not going to solve a lot of the issues and barriers that we're continuing to see in our community. And so we said, what else could we do? What can we learn? What are some of the other strategies that folks regionally across the state, across the country are working on? And began to take a look more at preservation strategies. And so that's how we began to learn a little bit more about what are some of the different strategies that we can do to continue to ensure that our folks have access to affordable housing that's truly affordable, and that folks are not being displaced and pushed out of their communities. We have folks in our community have lived here for 20 plus years. And so they have their social connections, their community ties, their children go to school here, their families, their friends. This is their home. And so being displaced from your community is a really impactful and hard thing. And so began to explore preservation as a strategy. And we're engaged with the housing department with a lot of the efforts, earlier efforts that Heather mentioned on the timeline that she shared around why we needed to take a look at anti-displacement strategies and tools, and really began to look at strategies that really center deep tenant engagement and control and decision-making power over their housing. We've heard, we hear from community every day how disempowered and how voiceless they feel often in terms of their housing situations. We also wanted to explore opportunities that provide ownership for folks. And again, really wanted to identify strategies that eliminate barriers to dignified affordable housing for low and extremely low and our undocumented folks and community. And so came across COPA as one of those strategies. We're also working on a local tenant preference policy. And we also took time to explore alternative housing models like limited equity housing co-ops, community land trusts, community development corporations. And a lot of that work is continuing to happen in tandem as we're exploring policies like the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. And so the community's been engaged from the very beginning around this policy. And Heather put up, the numbers for the amount of community engagement that the city has done. And we also did our own, right? We wanted to provide spaces where we could do some more popular education with folks. So held, I think maybe 5 or 6 community forums, bringing folks, inviting folks in to learn about the policy, what it would look like, what does it mean, what are all kind of the pieces or parts of the policy, but also to do some learning. So we explored policies in DC, we explored policies in San Francisco, We did that learning, and then we really asked folks, like, if a COPA was to be implemented in San Jose, what do we want to make sure that this policy includes? What are the key things that we want to make sure are included in the policy? And then we crafted a community version of the COPA framework that, you know, through a lot of work also with the housing department, with our coalition partners, with community, have done a really good job of aligning a lot of what we heard from community with the city, the housing department's current COPA framework. So we did, I think we did a really good job of ensuring that a lot of what we heard from community was really important and needed to be included in a framework actually was. And that includes, you know, I know we didn't dive really deeply into the framework itself, but we really wanted to emphasize things like the role of tenants and how important it is that there's deep tenant organizing, education, technical assistance, and support for folks through the COPA program. We want to make sure that folks have voice and autonomy over their housing. And so this is a really great way to ensure that that is happening. And it's a really big shift, I think, in the way that we traditionally, the traditional relationships that we see and we hear about in terms of tenant and landlord or property owner. We wanted to make sure that there was no displacement of current tenants. Again, this is an anti-displacement strategy, so we wanted to make sure that the tenants who are already living in those properties do not get displaced, and obviously that the properties remain permanently affordable. We knew that in order for this policy or framework to be really successful, there needed to be, you know, there needs to be a lot of funding and resources and support backing the program. I think in order for us to really build out this anti-displacement preservation ecosystem that we desperately need in San Jose, we need to invest in it. We need to be able to support the policies, the tools, the strategies in order to really see the impacts that we want to see in terms of anti-displacement for the city of San Jose. So we took a lot of what we heard from folks in the community. We've been working really hard with the housing department to you know, make sure that those things and those pieces, those community voices elevated in the framework as well, and feel really good about where the housing department is now with their COPA framework.
That's wonderful. So this question is for both of you, right? I'm looking at the chat right now and it's really blowing up, which is so exciting because that's the level of engagement that we would like for these types of conversation. And I see Ruthie Cahalan, for example, making comments about, you know, her concerns regarding this. Would love to hear from both of you throughout this kind of process. Who showed up, like, to the community meetings? Were there property owners who showed up? Were there single family owners who showed up? You know, were there apartment coalition members like showing up to these meetings?
You want to start?
No, go for it.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the spectrum of folks who are represented at the communities was really broad. And even from the beginning, right, like I mentioned that there was a stakeholder advisory committee in 2021, and that included, or sorry, there was also a technical advisory committee, right? And the technical advisory committee included folks from, you know, brokerage, like representatives. They included property owners, included industry groups, included real estate, realtor representatives, and so, and also, you know, consultants who are, you know, have technical experience with some of these issues. So they were involved. There's also, like I mentioned, the stakeholder advisory committee back in 2021, which was open to the entire public. Those meetings were translated into Spanish. More recently, we've had our meetings translated into Spanish, Vietnamese, Mandarin, and Cantonese. Simultaneous interpretation. We have materials available online. So, you know, we're really trying to make sure that we are making this information as accessible as possible to as many groups as possible. And then, as you know, Andrea mentioned, Somos has also been involved. I don't know if you want to talk more about the other community groups that have been involved.
Yeah, I think, like Heather mentioned, it's been really broad group of folks. We really tried to do our best to hear from communities that, you know, generally Somos does not really engage with. So we worked a lot with other organizations like Viet Unity, the Vietnamese American Roundtable, like to try to get input and hear from communities that we, traditionally don't work very closely with. But it was very broad. And again, I also think that really speaks to the need. I think everybody recognizes that there's a housing crisis. Everybody recognizes that there are things that we need to do to address the crisis. And so the amount of folks, the broad spectrum of perspectives that have attended all of these meetings, I think speaks to that.
And if I can just add on to the very end, I think one other thing to just mention is that, the feedback that we've received in these meetings has resulted in big changes to the policy. So, Con, you asked earlier, is a property owner required to sell to anyone at any point in time? And I said no. And that's actually because, originally the housing department was considering a quote unquote right of first refusal provision, where if a nonprofit housing provider actually matched an offer of a third party offer, that, the seller would be required to sell to the nonprofit. And that was taken out in response to community feedback and, again, to balance the interests of property owners alongside the interests of community members who are facing displacement in their communities.
One of the things I'm seeing in the chat is this difference between production versus preservation, right? So I'm going to go back to the slide that you originally had, Heather, where it showed just within 5 years, we in the Bay Area lost over 160,000 units to naturally affordable housing, right? And year over year, we are losing over 32,000. How does that compare to the rate of production, right? So right now, do we have a sense of how many new affordable housing units we're able to build versus, that 32,000 number?
Well, I think so. Then in our housing department memo, I think we did analyze this data. I think, if we average the number of affordable housing units over the last, 10 years or so that we were able to build. And in part, this is because one of the key components of the infrastructure for production disappeared during this period, right? This was the redevelopment funds, which were crucial for affordable housing. We lost those funds. And so without that source, affordable housing production declined during the 2012 or 2011 to 2016 period. But we produced about, on average, 94 units of affordable housing per year.
Say that number again?
94, according to the research we've done. It's clear that, more funding means more units, and that's true just as much for production as it is for preservation. But we have a lot of work to do.
Okay, I'm just going to do some quick math here. I think there are at least 5,000 unhoused neighbors in San Jose, right? So if I divide that 3 years just to house those individuals who are currently unhoused, is that right? Okay. So that's helping me kind of paint a better picture of this and a better understanding of what's going on here. Give me 1 second. I'm reviewing our questions and notes.
Yeah, I mean, I can just comment on that real quick while you're looking at that. But I mean, I think, that speaks to, the need to really make sure that our solutions for affordable housing are, we're using public funds responsibly. We know that we have a huge amount of need and we have limited resources. So how are we going to make sure that we're stretching our, our money as far as we can and make sure that they're actually addressing the issues that our communities have? And that's one of the reasons actually people talk about affordable housing preservation also as an important strategy, right? I just saw a comment in the chat about, how affordable housing preservation is more cost effective. And in fact, there is a report from Enterprise Community Partners from a few years ago that, has estimated so far that, affordable housing preservation is about, you get a deed restricted affordable unit from preservation as you do with affordable housing production. But it's about 30 to 50% more cost effective in terms of the amount of resources that are needed to preserve a unit versus produce a unit. And it's also quick. That's one of the other reasons we talk about affordable housing preservation. The timeline for that happening is about 1 to 2 years, as opposed to the timeline for producing a new unit, which between the pre-development process and just the, going through all the city approvals, in any city, not just in San Jose, it can take, 4 to 6 years for, from the beginning to the end of of building new affordable housing. So those are many of the reasons why people talk about, those are the big reasons why people talk about preservation as being important.
I want to center us maybe in like the community values conversation a little bit, right? As you are going out there and talking to the community, I wonder what are people saying when they are balancing, the value of a property owner who needs to wait an extra, 3 weeks in order to get paid versus the value of keeping a family, keeping a community in place and not displacing communities and disrupting their lives and families.
It's tough. It's been really tough. It's been tough personally for me to understand how we can even put those things on a scale. Waiting, 15 days doesn't match. It's not equal to put a family being displaced, a family becoming homeless, a family having to move from their city, from a home where they've been in 20 plus years. So it's difficult, I think, to continue to uplift those stories and continue to uplift the urgency and the impact that being displaced has on families, specifically children, with a timeline of 15 days.
Yeah. So I'm looking in the chat and there's a question asking about what happened at the recent San Jose City Council meeting. And I think this was a committee meeting, right? That happened earlier this week. It seems like a lot of the council members aren't convinced of this policy. I know that, there was a really great turnout for that meeting. I think over, 150 folks came out to provide comment at a committee meeting, right? So, this is a hot topic for the community. What were some of the concerns or issues that were raised by the council members, Andrea?
Not a lot of course, like some questions around where's the funding gonna come from in order to support COPA. Generally though, I think we heard a lot from folks around the need for production as a priority as an anti-displacement priority. And so I think we need to do a lot of more education and learning around anti-displacement strategies that include protection of tenants, production, and preservation. I think we need all three in order to really address the issue, the housing crisis issue. But preservation is a really big piece of those strategies. And so I think we need to, again, do some more learning, some education around why preservation is a really key strategy, why it's an effective strategy, why working in tandem with the other strategies, we can really address a lot of the issues and the needs that we're seeing for folks. And that was kind of clear from the comments that folks were making during that meeting, that there needs to be more time, more space for that learning. It's a shift, right? It's a shift in the way that we think about housing. It's a shift in the relationships that we have within housing. And so it was clear that folks needed to do some more learning.
And what were their feelings around like the displacement in particular, right? Like we as a city and as a community have a commitment to not displacing our neighbors and our brothers and sisters. And my sister had to move to Seattle because she couldn't afford living here with two boys any longer, right? And that was devastating to me. I don't get to see my nephews every week anymore. Right.
Yeah, I think folks are aware that displacement is an issue. I think we're maybe not aligned on the best strategy to address the issue. I think there's no doubt that that folks, that we care about our tenants, that we care about the folks in our community, that we want to keep people housed. I think just again, the strategy for how to do that, or the strategies for how to do that, I think, are not very well aligned.
Let me ask one last question. There's a sentiment shared in the chat that 2/3 of the speakers who showed up were against it, right? So 2/3 of the folks who left their jobs and were able to show up at a community meeting at 2 p.m., right, in the afternoon were against it. With the thousands of folks that you had to support or the opposition to this policy.
I'm sorry, Khan, you cut out a little bit and I didn't hear your question.
I was saying for the thousands of folks who showed out to your different community engagement efforts, like what was your feeling about, whether they were supportive or opposed to this policy?
I mean, I think we saw that day that it felt pretty even in terms of folks that came out in support of the policy and folks that are in opposition to the policy. I think generally there is a lot of misinformation that is being shared about the goals of COPA as a preservation strategy. I think there needs to be more education and learning around preservation as a whole, around the ecosystem that we need to build out in San Jose to address displacement. And that showed, I think, a lot in the comments that we heard from folks on opposition as to why this is not a good policy. There is data, there are reports, there is analysis that policies like COPA, that preservation policies work. That folks who do have policies in their jurisdictions have been able to preserve affordable units. And so there's a lot of information, I think, that we still need to do a better job of getting out there to the community, to folks, so that we can be informed about the goals and the strategies behind COPA.
Great. Well, clearly there's a lot to be learned. I work in this space and I've learned so much from this conversation. I want to give so much appreciation to both Heather and Andrea for your leadership and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help inform us and to help us continue this really important community conversation and hopefully this important policy. With that, let me hand it back to Emily from SV at Home for next steps.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Khan, Heather, and Andrea for sharing with us this update about COPA and where to go from here and the basics. We hope to share this information widely and broadly. For those of you who have been asking if the slides will be made available after this webinar, yes, they will be available. I will begin sharing a poll with the audience. For some reason, the poll is not working for me right now. But thank you all for coming. And we are, if you have any other questions, feel free to email us at info@sv@home and we will get it to the right place. Oh, someone got the poll. Yay. Wonderful. All right. And so with that, unless we have any other questions, that was our event. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. And we will get you the recordings and the slides very shortly. Thank you, everyone.